hmm Yeah, absolutely. In the United States, we get most of our news, most of the people in the United States get their news from television. Not a lot of people, by comparison, are reading the newspapers every day or reading political magazines or reading analysis or political science. So, yes, Americans get most of their news from television, and a large part of the television audience has been tuned in to the political convention. So, it's a major story. One of the things that's interesting is that the Democrats got significantly higher viewership than the Republicans did this year. That's not typical. I think it's a sign that there was more interest in Hillary Clinton's convention than in Donald Trump's convention. But these things are impossible to measure in some ways. And so what we find in the United States is that we think the electorate is going in one direction, and they can often head in a different direction without making pollsters or political scientists or elite aware of that change. And so you see these revolutionary changes in American voters. One candidate, President Nixon, back in the 1970s, referred to them as the silent majority. And the Republicans were able to marshal that silent majority in the 1970s and elect Richard Nixon as president. And we don't know if we're in a situation where we'll see that again. So, yes, many Americans tuned into the conventions. Many Americans were polarized one way or the other. Not a lot of opinions changed. People who were already predisposed to like Hillary or like President Obama are still there, and people who were predisposed to like Donald Trump or dislike Hillary are still there. So not a lot of change, but certainly a lot of attention to the process these last 2 weeks.
Fix it, Harrison? That sounded like you fixed it. Was that a victory?
hmm Yeah, two questions there. Money certainly plays an outsized role in American politics. There's no doubt about it. We have a very interesting situation now where Hillary Clinton has gone through traditional money channels, through donors, through the campaign, through the party, and has amassed a great deal of money both in her primaries and now ready for the general election. Donald Trump did not go that route. He did not raise a lot of funds in the primaries. He didn't spend a lot of money in the primaries, so unlike a candidate who failed, Jeb Bush, the brother of George W. Bush, Jeb Bush spent more than $100 million on advertising in the primaries and got almost no delegates. And so we saw a different type of scenario with regards to money in the primaries, and we don't know if that'll carry through. But certainly at this point, Hillary Clinton has a great deal more money than Donald Trump. And what that will allow her to do is that will allow her to spend money on organizations in battleground states like Ohio, like Pennsylvania, like Florida, and it will allow her to buy a great deal more advertisement. Now that could change. That could change. Well, I can tell you that it's mostly free and it's mostly unmonitored in the sense that every television station in the United States, with the exception of a few really great public broadcasters that we have here, National Public Radio, the public broadcasting system on television, every other one is at their own to try to raise funds, to sell advertisement, and to draw viewers to their programming. So that does cause a least common denominator where everyone does the same thing a lot of times, and everyone puts on the least expensive programming. But it's not government control per se. What it is, it's market control and it's capital control. And so what you'll find is that as you turn from channel to channel to channel in the United States, you'll see the exact same thing. You'll see live political coverage or a candidate speaking, but you won't see the in-depth reporting that maybe the United States was once famous for, maybe the kind of in-depth critique of our system that used to exist under CBS News or under the New York Times is vanished to a large part because of the Capitol, not because of government control, not because there's an agency that's in charge of that, because there isn't. Every broadcasting organization reports to their shareholders and not to the federal government. So that system means that we can have a lot of critique of our politicians, but it's often very shallow critique. And so when you have someone that is an untrustworthy candidate, the system may not be equipped to offer an in-depth analysis of that person's particular problems. It may not be able to dig beyond the surface in that case because the resources, the money, the viewership, the ratings aren't there for that. Well, first I wanted to respond to my colleague's comment about government fines for misinformation on the internet. That's a terrible tool of censorship. We're lucky that we don't have that in the United States. We do have though, a very problematic internet space in that it's become very crass and very profane in the United States, and so you cannot engage in an online forum in the United States in almost any capacity, whether it's the New York Times or a website based on investigative journalism or a reporter's personal Facebook page or a site reviewing an ice cream parlor in the middle of Arkansas. You can't engage in those forums almost at all without running into profanity, bad behavior, rudeness, crass behavior. It's really terrible what's happening with the internet in this country. So we don't have the problem that Egypt has, but we have our own unique problem in which where everyone has access and so many people are misbehaving with that access. And so regards to the political election, what's happening, it's very interesting. You have some websites that are doing a fantastic job of keeping the politicians honest, whether it's Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, Ted Cruz. There's a website called PolitiFact in this country that tests their speeches almost that day or certainly by the next day. The things that they say are tested as to whether they're true or not. And that's a fantastic website, and it's doing a great public service right now in the United States. And so we have that website, and then we have open access to almost every citizen on other websites. So you find a lot of discourse, a lot of conversation, some of it elevated, a lot of it not elevated. And so the internet is playing two roles here, really. One, really elevating our conversation, and the other one is really debasing our conversation about politics in the United States. And we don't know where the public is in this space. We don't know. We have a sense from pollsters where they stand, but really we won't find out until the night of the election. Right around midnight, 2 o'clock in the morning, we'll know where the electorate stands, and not really before that. Yeah, I think there's no doubt that television and digital platforms are merging. And so I think in 10 years from now, we won't be talking about television versus the telephone. I think they'll be the same space. Now, obviously, one screen will be larger or smaller. One screen will be on your wall. One screen will be in your pocket. But there is a space that you'll be going between both of those at all times. And so to follow up on the previous conversations, one of the things that I find really interesting about the evolution of Twitter, we saw Twitter and especially Facebook during the Arab uprisings, during the so-called Arab Spring in 2011. We saw those forums used really excellently by average citizens in countries throughout the Middle East. What I think you're finding in the United States, though, is that those forums are used slightly differently. They're not places of revolution, but they are certainly places of information flow. And so, for example, on Twitter, I have 1,000 of my favorite journalists feeding me their stories every day. And so, yes, I go to the New York Times every day, or I go to the Los Angeles Times, my hometown newspaper. I look at the Washington Post every day online, but most of my news is coming through Twitter. And so, like Amy, I will wake up, and the first thing I'll do is look at that for news. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, I think what's happening is a really interesting model that's starting to evolve, and it's the model of consumer producer. And so we on this side of the camera are used to producing shows that are distributed through mass media to 1 million people, 2 million people, 100,000 people, depending on how successful your show is in any given week. But I think what we're seeing is we're at the beginning of the consumer producer era where the most interesting content is going to come from someone who accidentally produces something of excellence, puts it out online, and that becomes part of our daily feed. Now, we're always going to need the wise people to help us interpret this news. We'll always need the columnists. We'll always need trusted journalists. But the producer consumer is a new model. Sure. Yeah, sure. Well, it's very interesting because in the United States media back in 2011, it was covered for the period of about 10 days, almost hour by hour. So it was covered very intensely at the beginning. But the U.S. media, in a lot of ways, then turned its attention back to the United States. So it was covered as something that was happening on the other side of the world. And once the really exciting part of the Arab Spring finished, the U.S. media turned its eyes away. So how did it manifest itself? Well, what I saw in the Arab media is that the Arab media was much more critical, much faster about the outcome. And so you saw in the Arab media, for example, the phrase Arab Spring became unfashionable, became a bad choice, became a poor way of describing what happened. Whereas in American television, that phrase lasted for years. That it might be a shock to our viewers to find out how long Americans still thought of that as 100% positive revolutionary change. Well, I think it signifies a lack of attention. I think really it gets back to what I was talking about earlier, where the U.S. media is very good at covering the surface, but not so good at digging into the surface. And so by the time the period came for real analysis, to actually ask what change happened, what changes were for the positive, what were for the negative, what is the outcome, where do we stand? By the time those questions were appropriate, most of the U.S. media had turned away. Now, you still had high-level journals asking these questions. You still had think tanks in Washington asking these questions. Al Hura was covering that sort of thing. But CNN, Fox, NBC, ABC were not asking those in-depth questions, and that's what they've lost. And so when we start thinking about criticisms of the U.S. media versus state-funded media around the world, those are the things that are missing, that deep analysis and the ability to ask those questions. Whereas in the United States 30 years ago, those questions would have been asked and they would have been dealt with and they would have been seriously considered by the great journalists of the past. But in American media, what's happened is in this market-driven space, a lot of our great journalists aren't on air anymore. You'll find places like CNN where their really experienced journalists were bought out, were put into early retirement, and they've got on set younger people who are energetic, who are interesting, who draw viewers but don't have the life experience to be able to offer real analysis, real deep analysis of these issues. And so that's where I think the U.S. media failed. And that's a really clear example of where it failed, the ability to see the whole story and not just to rear square in those 10 days. I think that you would be shocked at how undercovered that is. I think that considering how long the United States has been engaged in the Middle East, certainly going back to Egypt in the 1950s, the first Iraq War, the second Iraq War, the efforts towards Middle East peace, the U.S. government certainly is deeply involved. U.S. think tanks, academics, the elite in the United States is certainly interested in thinking about the Middle East. But for the most part, our media is not covering the Middle East in any really substantial way. What it's covering is the U.S. policy process vis-a-vis the Middle East. So it's covering the way that Americans are thinking about the region, but it's not covering the region to a great deal. Yeah. Yeah, certainly. And so the United States went live, gavel to gavel, with the Turkey coup attempt. We were watching that overnight here in the United States on CNN. So that was covered well. I thought that was covered well. It was covered appropriately. What's missing is the in-depth analysis afterward, as I said a moment ago, and it does parallel in some ways what my colleague was commenting on earlier about coverage of American politics on Egyptian TV. It's not appropriate that American politics be covered gavel to gavel, hours and hours on end in Egyptian TV, because there's not the viewer interest in that. Now, certainly, I would hope that there were half-hour shows, a few news packages throughout the day covering these issues 2 or 3 minutes at a time, but there's just no reason, there's no interest in the lives of the viewers to that great a degree. And I also think social media will fill that space. So I believe that today there will be a lot of social media about Khizr Khan's speech last night to the Democratic Convention. He's a Muslim American. He gave a very moving speech about the death of his son in the Iraq War. And he challenged Donald Trump to ask, what have you sacrificed? And it was probably the emotional highlight of last night's Democratic Convention. Even more emotional than the Hillary Clinton speech itself. It was really an interesting moment in American discourse, where we had someone who was an immigrant to the United States, a Muslim American whose son died defending this country, and he directly challenged in front of all of America Donald Trump to prove that his family had sacrificed as much as Mr. Khan's family had sacrificed. And so I think that that'll probably be all over social media today. I think it'll be it's certainly on Facebook all over America. And my belief is that it's probably going to hit Facebook, hit Twitter in the region in the Middle East, to an appropriate level, where, you know, the region has got all of its own issues to deal with between Turkey and Syria, as my colleague listed. So much going on that when stories rise to the surface, they will be covered. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I think we're done. Yeah, that was fun. Thank you. Thanks for including me. I'll do it anytime. All right, we're out.
All right. Thank you for that, Adam.
Yeah, it was fun.
All right.
Okay.
He's
It's
an